I'm host tonight because Gary is elsewhere, so that was part of the technical issues, but we've resolved that now. Anyway, good evening, everyone, and welcome. So I just want to try and summarize where we were up to from last week, and also perhaps spend a few moments at least looking at the Ramah that I quoted, which I sort of whizzed through, and out of Shiur, Adam and I have been having a conversation about what exactly the Ramah meant. So it was something he flagged in Shiur, and I didn't focus on. So we'll just try and look at that in a little bit more detail, just to check that we've understood and are understanding properly the Ramah and what I was trying to bring out from it. So we have a Gemara that tells us very simply that Tofer steht Führers, the Halo Kaima. The Gemara says, how can you be chayav for two tefillas? Surely, lo kaima, surely they don't have a kiyum. Now, there is a machlokas rishonim, which is summarized in the Ramah. That's what I was arguing in the last year, as to whether this din of tefillah shel kayama means objectively, fundamentally, whether the tefillah is sustainable, is long-lasting or not, in which case it would be part of a family of halachas with all melachos, or many melachos that we've seen previously, like kosev and boina, very widely different melachos that all need to be miskayemes, and according to some Rishonim, that's Peshat in the Mishnah. And in addition, this would then be potter aval osa. It would be osa midrabanon. It seems a general pattern that with the melachos, where they're not done in a way that is niskayim, they don't have a permanence to them, nonetheless they're also midrabanan. Or the alternative reading of the Gemara is that this is a unique halacha in Tofer, analogous to the unique halacha in kosher, where the Gemara says explicitly it's not toila on an objective sense, whether it's permanent or not, but on manas lahatir, on the way one's doing it, whether one's intention is for this to be a permanent tefillah or not. This is what I cited from the Rishonim, and the summary I brought of that is the Ramah in Siman Shin Yod Zayin Sif Gimel. Now, I glossed over the first half of the Shulchan Aruch because I wanted to keep life simple, but very briefly, the Shulchan Aruch is discussing two things. He's discussing the kesher. Apparently, when you got back clothes from the laundrette, they used to have knotted them in a certain way, and he says you're allowed to unknot them on Shabbos because it's not a kasher shul kayama. That's the first halacha. So this is clearly a halacha in hilchos kosher. Then the Shulchan Aruch says that you can't unknot a garment which is knotted for the first time. In other words, if it arrives at the tailor knotted up, you can't unlock it, because this isn't an issue of kosher. This is an issue of makeh b'patish, of masakin mana, of completing a utensil. Now, I don't want to go too far into the details of the halachas of makeh b'patish, but in very brief, completing utensil, the last hammer blow, is a generic malacha called makeh b'patish. For those who are interested in my Parsha and Halacha series on Wednesdays, where I do half an hour Parsha, half an hour Halacha, I went through the halachas of makeh b'patish in a great detail, not in the way that we do it in practical learning it from Gemara, but I went through the halachic principles behind it for because it's a half an hour practical halacha, and the recordings online if you want just to look at makeh b'patish in more detail, and I do discuss the lomdas there a little bit also. So, but in this forum we'll just leave it at that for now. Then the Ramah carries on, and he says even if it was already opened and then it was closed, also makeh b'patish would apply. Then the Ramah carries on, he says v'lechein, and therefore. Now, this v'lechein is a little bit deceptive, because the therefore isn't going on the thing he most recently presented, which is makeh b'patish, but it's going back to the previous halacha, which is the halacha of kesher shel kayama. And the Ramah says, even though it's not kayam, nonetheless it's also, it's forbidden to cut the stitching. That's the first view the Ramah brings, and he brings that from Argo's Mordechai that one can look up. And then the second view he brings is that no, you're allowed to because it's not a tefillah shel kayama. Now this bit of the Ramah is a specific halacha in Tofer, and the Ramah is saying that since the tefillah is not shel kayama, therefore it's also midrabanon. Opinion one, opinion two, it's mutter. I.e., the machlokas that we just summarized, that we just said, which is a tefira, which is not shel kayama, where, in other words, where it is, and perhaps even the Ramah means chayav, meaning to say it's tefira, which isn't shel kayama, meaning objectively it is perfectly good stitching, but subjectively it's made just to be temporary because the shop or the manufacturer sews the shoes together, and then once you buy them, you separate them. That's a machlokas, whether that is osa, chayav, or mutter. In other words, our very debate in our Gemara, the tefira, which is objectively permanent, but subjectively, intentionality-wise, is temporary, is that chayav or not? How do we learn pshat and asukas? That's what the Ramah says. Now, this machlokas over how to view a tefira shel kayama or not is a machlokas relevant to Tofer. It's not a machlokas relevant to Makeh b'Patish. In Hilchos Makeh b'Patish, this distinction is irrelevant. If it's the final hammer blow, if it's the completion of the garment, it's the completion. If it isn't, it isn't. Why is this not Makeh b'Patish? Surely the shoemaker stitched them together. The answer is because the shoes are fundamentally finished. They're simply attached, and detaching them, therefore, is the melachot of Tofer, not the melachot of Makeh b'Patish. What defines when something is Makeh b'Patish or not? A good question, a difficult question. I mean, surely every time I bake a bread, it should be Makeh b'Patish. Every time I finish weaving a garment, it should be Makeh b'Patish. How can you ever have any other melacha other than completing a melacha? Good question, and that's what I discussed in the Wednesday shiur. And there's several answers that are given. We once touched upon it in this series of shiurim also. But either way, something is only Makeh b'Patish where it fundamentally is incomplete and is then completed, as opposed to when it's merely removal of a barrier or the like. So if something gets broken and I fix it such that it wasn't able to be used and now I repair it, that would be Makeh b'Patish. If I'm merely removing something which is a barrier to use, that's not Makeh b'Patish. For example, if I have a plate which is dirty, the plate is unusable. If I clean it on Shabbos, this is perfectly mutter. Why isn't it Makeh b'Patish? Why isn't it completion of the plate or repairing a broken plate? The answer is because this isn't a broken plate. It's a good plate which happens to have some dirt on it. And therefore, similarly, over here, Makeh b'Patish isn't the relevant halacha. The relevant halacha is Tofer, and on that, the Ramah brings two opinions, whether Tofer of something which is impermanent is a problem or not, and that really gets down to depending how we learn pshat in our sugya. So this is part one of the topic. A machlokas, what the Gemara means, does it mean objective impermanence, or is there a unique chiddush with Tofer, like with kosher, that if I only ever made this as a temporary knot, a temporary stitching, it wouldn't be the melacha. Now I want to look at separate machlokas, Carbon, Nasanel, and Chazon Ish, and use that to remind ourselves of what we discussed when we looked at the melachot of Tofer, and hopefully that will bring greater clarity as to why there should be this unique halacha over here of Tofer perhaps needing a permanence. So this is the second thing that I wanted to look at. This isn't something we discussed last year, but I want to look at in this year. And the Carbon Nasanel, which I printed in the source sheet, the Carbon Nasanel, by the way, is Nasanel Weil. He was an early achron and a commentator on the Rosh, printed in footnotes on the Rosh. Yeah, I did print it. It's source 3 in the handout. I wasn't able to translate all the Yiddish terms in this piece, but he basically says that he's medayik something from Rashi. He quotes Rashi, who says, "V'kiven zelo kaima lav melachahi." Since it's not kayom, this stitching, it isn't a melacha. That's the first thing. That's his quote of Rashi. Says the Carbon Nasanel. Let's have a look at this inside. Mashma de ikar kushya sashas zelo hava av melacha. The kasha of the Gemara is it's not an av melacha. Aval pota aval osahu. It is osa midrabanon. So that's his diuk. That the Gemara never said that this is muta. The Gemara said this isn't a melacha, and that's reinforced by the language of Rashi. Therefore, he says, Toma ani, me ayin noigim ha'olam. How come we find that the minhag ha'olam is shetoichrim im machat, shekorin steknadel rather, Beloshan Ashkenaz, hakrais im amalbish shekorin shutza balaz. Now, Beloshan Ashkenaz. Now, a steknadel means a stick needle. Nadel is a needle, stek is a stick. It means a stick needle, what we would call a pin. So he's asking, how can you pin what seems to be some sort of bracelet or brooch, not a bracelet, a brooch. It cries as a circle, I think a brooch, onto a garment. So how can you pin a brooch onto a garment on Shabbos? Surely this is also midrabanon. True, it's not a tefira shel kayoma, but nonetheless, it is also midrabanon based upon the carbon sanel's diuk. And then he carries on, and he says, "Havish shtei tekifos." It's in and out, and therefore it should qualify as tofer. V'chein on noshem b'prag shemachabrim hashlai. Hashlai is a veil in machatim halalu with these needles, with what we would call a pin in English. Havish shtei tekifos, again it's shtei tekifos, and therefore I am amazed at the world that is muttering this. Now, there's several points to make about this carbon asanel. First of all, the carbon asanel is an important halachic source in which he's telling us this is potter aval asa, that an impermanent stitch would be asa. And by the way, this carbon asanel makes it into practical halacha. It's brought down by Rabbi Zobin, and the Mishnah Berurah cites it in, I think I printed the Mishnah Berurah in Simon Shin Mem, Sivkot and Kaf Zayin. I printed it in source 4. The carbon asanel is brought down la halacha. Now, the Chazon Ish isn't happy that this is brought down la halacha for several reasons. The first thing is, the Chazon Ish says, look, the carbon asanel himself acknowledges that this isn't the minhag ha'olam. And he records that this is what everyone does in Prague and in other important locations. So a carbon asanel is saying, Tomani, I don't understand it. Okay, but you can't say that's Asa when evidently this is common practice. And he says that, these are choshev killers in Klal Yisrael, and the silence of the poskim, all the other poskim indicate, Prague had choshev rabbonim, the silence of the poskim indicate that they were not concerned with this. Minhag is important in halacha. Obviously, there can be false minhagim and minhagim which are wrong. But here, where, we after all, we have a diuk from a Rashi about this, even if we accept the diuk, maybe there's another distinction going on over here. And the Chazon Ish therefore establishes a principle that a needle, or a pin rather, which is threaded in and out in a stitch-like manner, is not considered a tefira. This isn't the way of sewing, and that's the basis of the minhag that this is mutter. Why should this be mutter? Because this is intrinsically a tefira lashar. In other words, even though structurally it's perfectly permanent, you could leave a garment pinned for a very, very long term and it would stay strong. Nonetheless, the nature of pinning with a stiff needle, a stiff pin, rather than a thread, indicates that fundamentally it was never designed to be permanent. So basically, we have a machlokes between Chazon Ish and carbon asanel in drabonons, whether a pin like this would be asa midrabanon or not. And actually, it's even a machlokes in deraisos with the chiyuv chatos. Because if you had a permanent pin that was locked in place, and we have a word for this in modern English, a safety pin, which clips closed and therefore doesn't slip out like a regular pin, the carbon asanel would say this is chayav min haTorah, and the Chazon Ish would say this is mutter because this isn't derech tefira. So this is the machlokes between the Chazon Ish and the carbon asanel. In a moment, I want to explain what we can draw out of this machlokes, but before I go further, just want to pause in case anyone wants to, if this was reasonably clear, if people managed to get to this through their learning of the two.
Is the main difference the fact that there's no cotton involved in this pin? Because is the diuk from the Gemara is presumably involving tefiras with cotton. So the Chazon Ish would seem to have a very strong argument to say that it's not the same, it's not comparable.
When you say cotton, I think the point is cotton, literally, but a thread versus a pin, yes, that's the Chazon Ish's point.
Yeah.
However, we've already established that it's not enough just to say a rule mathematically applied from the Mishkan. In the Mishkan, they use thread, therefore the melachot is only thread. There has to be a svara to this. As I spoke about last week, not every difference is a distinction. And one has to understand why it makes a difference that it is a pin, not a thread. And on that, the Chazon Ish says there's a very clear difference. A pin is structurally impermanent, even if in theory, my intention was to leave it there permanently, and therefore this will never be the melacha of Tofer.
But Rashi, when he's interpreting Shekashram, he's talking about a thread there.
Correct. And so you're asking that, are you saying that as a statement or a question?
just a statement, just because that again, in relation to what Max was saying, that we're dealing with that Rashi has dealt with a thread when he's saying that it's going to be a chiyuv.
Yes, Rashi and you're correct, Paul, and Rashi is correct, and Max is correct. The Mishkan, Rashi, all the poskim are talking about threads. The question is, the first time we find a debate about pins is this Chazon Ish and Carbon Asanel. So here, now we get to a conceptual question, which is thread lav dafka, and a pin would be the same, which is the assumption of the Carbon Asanel, or no, somehow a pin is different. Now, it's true that all these earlier poskim and sources are talking about threads, but one can't just declare a difference as a divine fiat, as a Gzeos HaKosov. One has to understand why does it make a difference? Why should there be such a distinction? And the answer to the question is the argument of the Chazon Ish. One doesn't have to go with the argument, but it's a very reasonable argument that a pin is not threading, it's not sewing. It's true functionally, mathematically, objectively, it's structurally, it's the same as a thread, as a stitch, but the whole role of the pin is something different, and therefore it wouldn't be B'chlal Tefira. Just to expand a bit on this, I want to remind you of a discussion that we had several weeks back when we learned kosher. Now, kosher is problematically similar to Tofer, because when you knot two threads together, surely this is simply a way of combining two pieces of fabric together. In which case we asked, how is kosher different to Tofer? And we gave three potential answers to that question, one of which we proved wrong, at least according to the Rambam, and then two viable answers. And this is Chazorah. Have a look at your notes or the recordings, but I'll just run it through briefly. The first suggestion we said was that with Tofer, it becomes one piece, whereas with kosher, it doesn't become one thread. And we saw that was incorrect, because the Rambam said that when you twist threads into one thread, that would be a tolda of kosher. We then saw two other possible explanations. One is it depends whether you use something else to bind it. So Tofer, sewing, is when you use a third item to bind the two bits of fabric together, such as glue or stitching. Whereas kosher is when you bind the fabric together by itself through knotting or twisting if it's the thread. That's a perfectly viable and good answer. A second answer we gave, which was Ramoshe Feinstein, the Aruch HaShulchan and others, is that the difference is that with a knot, you unknot it, whereas with a thread, you tear it. And that was in a sense going back to the first answer, but with a tweak, that the whole point of tefillah is that it has a certain permanence to it and it becomes merged into the garment. The thread loses significance and it just becomes one piece of fabric. This is how you make fabric. Sometimes you weave fabric into cloth, and sometimes when the cloth you have is the wrong shape or not large enough, you join and merge two pieces of fabric together in order to become one piece of fabric through sewing. And therefore, the normal way of undoing stitching is by tearing as opposed to unknotting. So said the poskim. Now, certainly if we say that latter svara, we understand well why pinning, even though it's a third binding agent, and in that sense qualifies as Tofer, nonetheless, pinning doesn't qualify as Tofer. Because the whole point of the melachot of Tofer is that this makes one fabric and two fabrics into one. Whereas with pinning, by definition, it's a hard pin that's held in place. It's by definition impermanent. And we therefore also understand why Tofer may be almost unique amongst the halachas, amongst the melachos of intentionality mattering. Even though the stitch I do is fundamentally permanent, nonetheless, if my intention is to de-stitch it, to detach it, it wouldn't count as the melachot Tofer, because the essence of the melachot Tofer is making two fabrics, two cloths into one, and therefore it has a permanence associated with it. As soon as it's impermanent, I haven't done the melacha. Don't think about Tofer. If I write on a wall with condensation, that is writing. I've created an image that carries content. It's just impermanent. And that's the general rule of impermanence. If I create a building that's weak and will fall down very quickly, I've created the structure, it's just impermanent. Whereas with tefillah, if it's not permanent, it isn't the melacha at all. It's not that I've done the melacha, but it lacks chashivas because it's impermanent. It's not the melacha at all. The essence of the melacha is making one garment into two, And I haven't done that when it is impermanent. It hasn't become one cloth. Sorry, the essence of the melachot is making two cloths into one, and I haven't done that when it's impermanent. So this is the svara over here of the Chazon Ish, and this would seem to be also the svara of the poskim who understand that's the essence of Tofer, and this would explain why there's a machlokes rishonim over here, where there's perhaps a unique halacha around Tofer as opposed to other melachos about how they are how they work. Okay, so that's the Chazon Ish and the Carbon Asabel. And the reason I brought these sources, normally I don't bring sort of every machlokas on the sukkah, but for me these sources were helpful in opening my eyes to understanding why Tofer might be unique amongst the melachas. I mentioned already that the Carbon Asabel is brought to Halacha by the Mishnah Berurah and it enters into practical Halacha, despite the Chazon Ish's protestations. However, this led me to realize that possibly I made a mistake in the sugya and in my understanding of the Ramah with which we started the topic. And this is because I don't understand or didn't understand how the Mishnah Berurah can reconcile bringing the Carbon Asanel lahalacha. In other words, paskening that this pin, which is done with intentionality to be temporary, is asa, when the Ramah himself in Shiur Zayin brings a view that you can tear stitching, which is not kayama, which seems to indicate that Tofer, which is not permanent, is allowed. So how can you reconcile the Carbon Asanel with that viewpoint? More than that, we have another Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Mem Sifov, where the Shulchan Aruch says that you cannot tighten a thread on Shabbos. He talks about where two threads have separated from each other, and you tighten them. I'm trying to see if I brought this. Yeah, I brought this on page 5. Sorry, source 5 on the top of page 2. Osom, let's have a look at this inside. This is the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Shin Mem Sif Zayin. Osom shemahadkim habagodim soviv zeroseim. Those who tighten with a thread clothes around their forearms through a thread that you pull and tighten. So the way to picture this is if you imagine a hoodie, which or the like, which has a string, like a little rope that goes through it, and you sort of pull the cords, and that's how you tighten it. So in the world of pre-button and pre-elastics, you've probably seen this in sort of Elizabethan and Victorian Elizabethan costumes, I'm sorry. You would have a thread or a string that went through the ends of the sleeves, and you would tighten the string in order to tighten the end of your sleeving. And the Shulchan Aruch says that you're not allowed to do this on Shabbos if the thread is stitched tightly through the garment. In other words, sometimes you have, if you picture this hoodie, sometimes the little cord that goes through it is very tightly bound, such that it's almost stiff. And if you tighten it, it sort of holds itself with the permanence. On the other hand, it could be very loosely thread through. Says the Shulchan Aruch, if it's tightly thread through, you're not allowed to tighten it on Shabbos, because this is like tightening threads. So in Siman Shin Mem Sif Vav, which I printed in source 4, the Shulchan Aruch says that if you have threads which have gone loose in your garments, you're not allowed to tighten these threads by pulling them, because that's an act of sewing midrabanon. In Siman Zayin, the Shulchan Aruch also extends this to tightening your cords on your sleeves, to tighten it on your hoodie cords if it's tightly stuck in. The question is, surely this is identical to the scenario in Siman Shin Yud Zayin, in which the Ramah brought two opinions. Here the Ramah doesn't say anything. In which the Ramah brought two opinions about temporary tightening. Now it is true that this tightening of the threads structurally is a sound tightening. Nonetheless, the Ramah brought a view that since the intentionality is for this to be temporary, it would be mutter. And that's what you're doing. You're tightening your sleeves when you wake up in the morning and get dressed Shabbos morning, and you loosen them at the end of the day when you wish to remove your shirt or your garment. So why does the Shulchan Aruch paskin unchallenged by the Ramah that this is asa? And the only answer, sorry,
I was just gonna, I still come back to the Shin Yud Zayin, but I understood. I read the Mishnah Berurah on that, and actually with the actual ason and latek or lachtok is talking about korea. it's talking about Korea al-manach l'takein. So why can't you say that Simon's a law in Korea as opposed to Tofer?
I think that is exactly right, and this is what the error that this made me realize. The only answer to this question is that the symmetry I was assuming between the melachot of Tofer and the melachot of Korea is incorrect. And the Shulchan Aruch in Shiur Zayin, in which he says that Korea is mutter because it's impermanent, does not mean to say that with Tofer it would be mutter because of its intentionality of impermanence. And I think the reason for this is some sort of compromise. I don't want to go into too many details, but Korea is only a malacha when your intention is to re-sow. Whereas a Korea where your intention is not as preparation to re-sow wouldn't be Korea. And therefore with Korea, where there's anyway, let's say in the scenario of Shiur Zayin, where you're separating the shoes, and you have no intentionality of reattaching it, it's anyway drabanan. And therefore the Ramah says, since it's impermanent, you have a double drabanan, and it would be mutter. But with Korea, with Tofer, even the Ramah would agree that if it's structurally sound, albeit intentionality-wise impermanent, that this would be also midrabanan, like other non-permanent melachos. And if I think this is the conclusion of this, that we see from the Shulchan Aruch, who talks about tightening one's armbands, these arm cords, that my assumption was wrong, and that at least in practical halacha, we do find it's machlokes rishonim, but in practical halacha, the matter is resolved l'chumra, that a temporary attachment would not be mutter, but would be osa, and it's only with Korea where there's this leniency of impermanence. So just to summarize, so that this doesn't...
Sorry, Rabbizobin, I thought it was the other... I'm reading Korea as not a leniency, it's actually, it says it's oson and not take, whether it's to ein chilek with the tefir of kayama or ein shel kayama. So isn't it actually a chumrah on Korea?
The second view of the Ramah is that it's mutter. If it's
okay.
osa, then it's identical to what the Shulchan Aruch says with tightening and loosening these strings on the ends of the sleeve. However, if it's mutter, that's the problem. So just to summarize, so we don't leave with a complete tangle, we have a Gemara that tells us that Tofer is only a melacha if it's shel kayama. And there's two ways to jump in reading this Gemara. Either the Gemara means it's mutter or it's asa drabanan if it's not kayama, number one. And secondly, either the Gemara means structural impermanence or even structural permanence, but intentionality of impermanence. That's point number one. Point number two is we have a machlokas carbon asanal and chazanish, where the Mishnah Berurah paskins like the carbon asanal l'chumra for the stringent possibility, in which the carbon asanal maintains that a regular pin is asa drabanan and a safety pin would be chayev min haTorah. And the Chazanish says nothing doing. That's not sewing. Sewing is with threads, not with pins. That's the second machlokas that we have. And the third point we have is that when you crunch together the Ramah in Shiur Zayin Sif Gimel and the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Mem Sif Zayin, it turns out that in practical halacha, a impermanent stitching, one isn't allowed to sew. That is certainly osa, but one would be allowed perhaps to unravel, which is that there is no parallel drabanan with unraveling, though there is a drabanan when it comes to sewing. So that's the conclusion of the analysis of the Rishonim down to practical halacha on the first few words of the Gemara, the first three words of the Gemara, which the Gemara says v'halo kaima, which the Gemara assumes that a non-kaim stitching would not be the melacha min haTorah. So we'll stop there, and in the next year we'll start with the Tosis Yom Tov and the other sources I printed, in which we'll look at the second part of the Gemara, the answer of the Gemara, where the Gemara talks about needing to put knots at the ends of the threads.
Oh, yeah.
I wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much. As always.